Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. Every episode, we break down leadership challenges, workplace culture, and the strategies that help professionals navigate an ever-changing world of work. I'm Ed Schaefer, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Andy Siegmund. Today, we're focusing on something that every leader, manager, and professional encounters: feedback. It's one of the most powerful tools for growth, but let's be honest, it's not always well done. Sometimes it's too vague, too critical, or so sugar-coated that it's meaningless. Other times it's late, inconsistent, or just never happens at all. Feedback is so important that we're making this a two-part conversation. Today, we're talking about giving feedback, because let's be real, that's what most people worry about. How do I say this? Will they take it the wrong way? How do I make sure it actually helps? Next time, we're talking about something that's just important and often overlooked, which is receiving feedback. Because a lot of people put a lot of thought into how their feedback will be received, but not nearly as much into how they receive feedback themselves. So let's start where all feedback begins, with the person giving it. So Andy, what makes feedback actually helpful for you rather than just words?
Yeah, so I think there are a few key points with feedback, right? Most importantly, it's got to be timely and it's got to be actionable. It's got to be something that you can actually do. And timely, I want to make sure that we harp on here, right? Because oftentimes at organizations, we give feedback in these like heavily structured, super infrequent, things, right? Whether it's quarterly or biannually or even just annually in a performance review. Um, it's very difficult to use feedback when it's given a that infrequently and b that far away from the actual occurrence of the event for which feedback is necessary. Anyone who's ever trained an animal can tell you, pretty clearly that, if you say bad dog to your dog while your dog is peeing in the house, you're going to have way better luck than if you say bad dog to your dog hours after they did the bad thing, right? Humans work generally in the same sort of way. It's not quite that simplistic, but that's something that I think we often need to think about when we're giving feedback. And then, if we're gonna, generally, I think when we talk about feedback, we're talking about constructive criticism or saying that you're doing something incorrectly. It's got to be actionable and it's got to be really, really clear, right? If I just say, Ed, that's bad, it's really not useful. I need to give you context, I need to set the scene, and I need to give you tools to improve that in the future. So, Ed, I'm curious your thoughts. Agree, disagree? I'm sure I missed a bunch of points.
Yeah, well, I think the main thing about feedback is that it's not about pointing out what's already happened. It's really about helping someone improve going forward. So it really should be future focused. If you're focused just on the behavior that's already happened and things that happened in the past, it's not really feedback. It's just commentary, and in some cases, it's judgment. So I think that the forward looking aspect of it, and focusing on the future and improvement is really important. So yeah, I think and you kind of talked about a few of the key principles that we broke down for this discussion about effective feedback. So the first one was future focus that I just brought up, and I do think it should guide future behavior. And the feedback that I receive should help me be a better employee, a better person, a better leader in the future, instead of making me just think about the past and my mistakes. And then the point you brought up is definitely, I fully agree. It should be timely and frequent. I think too often we wait too long to give feedback because maybe we're uncomfortable or we're looking for just the right perfect moment to be able to give that feedback. And if you wait too long, it's irrelevant. Um, or it could even be overwhelming in the wrong situations. And then it needs to be free, like you said, it needs to be frequent enough that it's not just a rare occasion or once a year. Actually, this reminds me of a situation that happened to me, which was I got a performance review once where I went in expecting it to be a great performance review, and I wound up getting a bunch of negative feedback. But the feedback that I received, I'm hesitant to even call it feedback now that I understand feedback better. But it was not actionable, and most of it was so late that if I had gotten this feedback 6 months ago or 8 months ago or 9 months ago, I would have actually been able to do something with it and changed the behavior that I was doing. That it probably would have never even gotten brought up in that performance review. And so by the time that I heard it, it was basically a waste of time. So I'm curious, have you ever gotten feedback too late to do anything about it?
Yeah, and I, I feel like I've been super fortunate that I've always worked for individuals and organizations that have been really ambitious about scheduling regular meetings with my direct line manager, right? One-on-ones, never more infrequent than say every other week. However, I do think that it is an anti-pattern that I've seen too frequently, where folks hold their proper feedback till that mid-year or that annual review. And I think that some of that's driven by just the discomfort of giving feedback, and then the necessity of doing it as part of the review. Um, Feedback's a really uncomfortable thing for individuals to do. And one of the other things I've also seen, which has been super frustrating for me, is like when people give feedback but are not objective about it or try to soften the blow as much as possible. Right. So, using like, I think sometimes, sort of, well, like all these sort of different qualifiers really undercut the feedback. And as a recipient can make it a setup where it's like, wait, do I need to listen to this feedback? Do I not need to listen to this feedback? Right. And it undercuts the authority of the person giving it to them, which, like, I feel like is this pattern that folks fall into, where it's like, I don't want to upset you or insult you because I've got to tell you something that is constructive criticism, which can be a touchy subject. So I'm going to soften the blow as much as possible. And I think the best givers of feedback are clear, and they're super direct, and it's pretty immutable. It's an observation, and ideally there is a recommendation for a fix in there somewhere, right? It might not be the exact prescription for it, but it might be, resources that you can pursue, or even just simply the request for you to come back next week with things that you think you can work on to improve this particular item.
Yeah, and that takes us so our next principle around effective feedback is it needs to be specific and observable. Like you mentioned, it should focus on clear behaviors and not vague
Mhm.
impressions. So, you did this thing, not, oh, you seemed distracted or you seemed like you had an attitude or whatever. It needs to be the specific behaviors that are identified. Um, and the in my own experience, I because as we were putting this together, I was thinking about feedback that I've received and how it was given to me. And what came to mind was I've received the same feedback twice, but in different ways from different people in completely different contexts. And the way it
Mm.
was delivered um, really had a big impact on how well I was able to receive it. So in one case, it was like a meeting that was a community of practice type of meeting, and when I was there, I was really excited about the topic, and I think I just read a book about it, so I was sharing some additional things or adding some nuance to the details that the presenter was sharing. And afterwards, I got some feedback from someone that was, and I can't remember exactly, so I'm paraphrasing to the best of my memory. But they basically said, "Hey, when you speak up all the time like that and share all these things, it makes you seem kind of like a know-it-all." And
Mm.
that was basically the feedback, right? And I was kind of like, first I was a little defensive, and it was kind of weird to take that feedback, but I did my best to take it. But then in a different context, I was out at a training, and a similar kind of thing happened. We were going through the training materials. It was something I was super interested in, so I kept jumping in or raising my hand to answer the questions. And on a break, one of the instructors, who I knew, so had a pretty good rapport, but he came up to me and he gave me some feedback. And his feedback was, "Hey, I can tell you're really excited about this, and that you're really into this, and it's something that you have thought about and read about and that sort of thing, and that's awesome. And I love your participation. But when you jump in and answer all these things or share something, there's actually other people in the class who it kind of gives them a pass that they can hang back, or they don't have to answer anything, or they don't have an opportunity to. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just hold back on some of those things? And after other people have a chance, if you have something you want to add, you can jump in, or maybe you can just hold it and we can chat about it, at some other time or offline or whatever. And in that case, that was great feedback by comparison, because I understood exactly what it was I was doing and the impact it was having. And then he just kind of gave me a little bit of guidance on how I could alleviate the situation. And for me, it's kind of night and day when I compare those two pieces of feedback. One of them I was not happy to receive, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And the other one was like very clear, and it didn't feel personal in any way. So it was much easier to take. Um, so yeah, that's definitely my experience with the specific and observable, and how it can make a big impact, whether you focus on behaviors or whether you try to focus on the person. And then the last principle that I know we wanted to talk about, and you kind of mentioned this, was the feedback should be actionable. We should be able to do something with it. And I think one area that we, have some slightly different opinions, and I know I think I've been bringing you along on this opinion, is that I like that the feedback should be actionable, but not necessarily prescriptive. I think in a lot of cases, especially for like a manager, or if it's somebody who's reporting up to you, we may have an inclination or a tendency to want to tell them what they should do in the future. And I think a lot of times we need to give them space to figure out what to do with that feedback, and let them decide how they want to approach it or what they want to do with it. And I think there's a risk of being prescriptive and telling someone what to do, and they could take it the wrong way. Where if I, uh, tell them the behavior and the impact, and then maybe say like, "Hey, do you think you could do it differently next time?" and leave it open to them, but also make sure they know that they could come to me if they aren't sure what to do differently, or they want to discuss some options or ideas, that I'm open to that. But I don't want to come off as I know better, so I'm going to tell you exactly what you should do with
Mm.
this feedback. So, what do you think about that? What do you think's the difference between guiding someone towards improvement versus telling them what to do in terms of feedback?
Yeah, so I think the core of our disagreement on this, Ed, is I think your default stance is a coaching stance, right? I'm going to help you uncover the best outcome for you, or the best set of behaviors for you. Whereas I think my background is a bit more, coming from a teaching stance of I know the answer and I'm going to feed you the answer. And I don't want to say that one is inherently better than the other. I think it depends on how authoritative you are as an individual in the subject that you are providing guidance on, right? So if you are truly a subject matter expert, and it's the type of thing where like there's a clear better way to do it, and you know that better way to do it, I think you can be serving, your team well by giving them that cleaner route, if you will. I think there are other, and I think it also depends on individuals and how they receive feedback. Some folks need to figure things out for themselves. Some things are highly individualized and need to be figured out for themselves. I do remember one of my teachers. Uh, we've talked about this. I have a background in classical music, and I remember one of my teachers told me flat out that he could not teach me how to play. All he could do is suggest better ways to do what I was already doing. And I thought that was insightful, right? Because within that domain, like there is an actual right or wrong. You're either playing the right note or the wrong note. You're either playing the right speed or the wrong speed, right? The right rhythm or the wrong rhythm. And but when it comes to like the technical aspects of playing a given instrument, there's not a correct fingering. There are just more efficient ways to move your hands across the instrument for a particular phrase, or what have you. And I think that guidance, like I don't know. I think we often step into a lot of gray zones in these conversations and then come out without a conclusion. And I think we're going to be there again. I think it's super duper nuanced, right? I think it depends on the individual, how they receive things, how much domain expertise you have over the piece, and what the problem is that you're really trying to solve, right? Because every individual is a little bit different. And I think that if you're going to provide guidance, you've got to be able to transition between teaching and coaching and know when to make that transition between, no, I'm going to tell you the right way to do this. And you have to put an equals sign at the beginning of your Excel formula. Otherwise, it's not going to be a formula. You're just going to have a bunch of numbers in there, right? As opposed to, you could do this in Excel or Sheets or Smart Sheets or like on a calculator or whatever tool that you want, but like I need this report every week, right? I think maybe not a great example, but I think that you need to understand how to kind of move back and forth between those two domains, and when it's appropriate to wear either hat. Um,
Yeah. Well, and
so
that were something we had talked about in preparation for this too was that feedback and performance management are there might be overlap sometimes, but they're not inherently the same thing. So feedback should be, since we said it needs to be timely and regular and happening frequently, um, it needs to be detached in some ways from performance management. So in the example that you're giving, maybe the first time we can give the feedback and leave it open, and if nothing changes, then maybe over time it turns from being a feedback conversation into a performance conversation, which does shift things a little bit from, instead of it being how are you going to be successful in the future in this organization and like how can we make sure your future success is there, the performance management is saying like right now you may be not successfully succeeding here, so we need to have some discussions about that.
yeah, I think that that's fair, right? And feedback is a growth opportunity. It's not intended to be punitive, but failure to capitalize on enough growth opportunities is likely to result in something punitive, right? The way that work is structured in our current society, companies that aren't growing are considered to be failing, and I think that individuals who are not growing, the same thing happens, right? Especially at more top tier companies, right? We talk about the bar being raised every year. So last year's acceptable performance is not necessarily acceptable this year, right? So we've got to find ways to grow as individuals, right? To become more efficient, to become more effective, to have more influence and a larger domain of influence within our organizations. And feedback is designed to do that, overall.
Yeah, well, so we've established what makes feedback effective: future focused, timely, specific. But even when you know that, the way you deliver feedback matters just as much. So let's break down some of the best practices for giving feedback to help people out there improve how they're giving feedback. So I say step one, I believe this, and I think I originally heard this from Manager Tools podcast, but I think step one for giving feedback is asking for permission first. And just a quick like, hey, can I share some feedback, or are you open to some feedback? It sets a respectful tone. It prepares the receiver to be able to actually receive the feedback instead of just throwing it at them or blindsiding them. And I know when I get asked for permission, there may be times when maybe my headspace is somewhere else, or I'm on my way to another meeting, or something important is happening, and maybe I can't take that feedback in right now. So if I have an opportunity to say, hey, not right now, then that can be great for me to be open to receiving that feedback in the future. So, what do you think about
Yeah.
the idea of asking permission? Do you think that changes the equation a little bit?
I think generally it's a good practice, right? And something we should always aspire to. Um, the caveat will be, when somebody denies permission, right? Understand the context, but don't let it slide. Generally speaking, so I'm not saying, Ed says actually right now is not a good time. Well, let's put a pin in it and let's find that time and ideally try to schedule that time, because one of the things that frequently happens is, in that context, we just might fail to ever provide that feedback. And sometimes that's okay, but if that becomes a broad practice, it makes it really hard to give timely feedback, right? So I would encourage folks to, at least like schedule a time, or like grease the skids as to when you're going to circle the wagons, when you do have to punt, just that it doesn't get lost, so you can pick that conversation up later. But I think as somebody who's been like, asked permission before, as somebody who's asked permission a bunch of times, I think it sets a more egalitarian tone rather than just like full throttling. I'm going to give you some feedback right now, which can come off as like not ideal, generally speaking. And one of the things you can also do within that, right? And again, it comes to context, but I'll be specific, right? So if if Ed works for me and Ed is doing some presentations and I'm in the room, I will probably take some notes on Ed's presentation, to help him become a better presenter, right? So, it's not often as a presenter that you get direct feedback from audience members. It's very useful to have people who can do that. So I would likely, in that context, tell Ed, hey, I've got, great presentation today. I've got some notes. Let me know when you'd like to go over them, and I can provide you with what it feels like being on the receiving end of what you're doing. We can then have a constructive conversation about it. I find when we go about things that way, it can be really, really, really helpful and really, really constructive.
Yeah, totally. And I think the only, to your point about if you ask for if you ask if you can give feedback and they say no, um, yeah, don't let it slide. Don't ignore it, or pretend like it never happened. But you might not need to loop back around and give that feedback because maybe they already know. Maybe it's, they got frustrated and like they know that that's what the feedback's going to be. And if you if they say no, and maybe you'll never see that behavior again. And so you don't need to worry about that feedback anymore. And that'd be totally
Mhm.
okay. And if the behavior happens again, then you have another opportunity to engage in feedback and ask for permission. But yeah, if you see a pattern of no, I don't want the feedback, no, no, like we said earlier, at that point, it's probably shifting from a feedback conversation into a performance conversation because receiving feedback should be kind of an expectation of performance to some extent. But
Yeah,
we'll
precisely.
I know we'll talk about how to build a culture where this sort of a behavior is good. But I know we wanted to get through the best practices first for people who just like, how do I give better feedback? So we said step one is asking for permission, and then once you get the permission, just describe what you observed. And as we already said, we need to focus on behaviors. It needs to be specific behaviors that you saw. It can't be assumptions or personality. You can't say it seemed this way or it made me feel like this. It needs to be the specific behaviors, um, because otherwise it can feel kind of personal. So have you
Mhm.
ever gotten personal feedback, or how do you approach making sure you're talking about the observations?
Yeah, I've gotten personal feedback, or the worst I've gotten was feedback that both felt personal, but then was about a behavior that I then saw the feedback giver exhibiting point for point later, right? So, also remember, right, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, or if it is something that you as an individual know is a weakness of yours, which might make you super well attuned to identifying it in others, you need to call that out explicitly, or it's not going to land well, right? If I tell Ed that he needs to curse less, he's going to, you know, laugh at me and say that, I should probably pull the rod out of my eye before, criticizing the splinter in his.
Yeah. So yeah. So let's see. We ask for permission, describe what you observed, and then the next best practice would be explaining the impact. So clarify why it matters for performance or for the team. Um, I I could think of too many stories of times when I've received feedback where I got the feedback, but I didn't know what the impact was. And as far as I could see, there what maybe was no impact in some cases, and so it was kind of like, what use is this feedback? What difference does this make, or how can I apply this feedback in any way to see a meaningful outcome
Mhm.
or change. So you got to make sure that you can understand the impact. Anything about the impact piece that stands out to you?
Yeah, one of the things I found really effective. So, for context, I've worked with a lot of earlier career individuals. Most of my career has been in consulting in one way or another, and I find asking them a lot of questions about the business, about the engagement that they're leading or working in it within, and what we're trying to accomplish and why we're trying to accomplish it. So, asking a lot of open-ended questions, sometimes leading questions, help them come to the conclusion of why things are important and then provide the feedback, right? So if you can help your team really understand the context of what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it's important to the people involved, and then tie your feedback into that, it can be really, really, really effective. Right. And I like to do it with the impact before the feedback, because that way ideally you can almost avoid having to give the feedback directly, right? With somebody who's sharper, they'll say, "Oh, now that I understand the full impact, when I did XYZ, it likely did ABC," and aha, right? And now you've helped them think in your brain for a little bit, which I think can be really critical for accelerating growth.
Yeah, definitely. And that'll take us to our last practice that we wanted to share for feedback. And I know we kind of had some discussion around this. So, as we said, first, ask for permission. Next, describe what you observed, is focusing on behaviors. And then after that, explain the impact to make sure they understand why it matters. And then, so the next step, we've heard all sorts of different things, right? We've heard the idea of, um, inquire as to why, ask them about why they did the behavior or whatever. And I think um, the more I've come to experience different things and the more I've come to practice this, I think when you have a good feedback culture, uh, you shouldn't really need to have feedback discussions or conversations, right? Feedback should be quick, should be painless, it should be frequent, it should be regular. So where we decided to take it was, for now at least, we're saying that the last step is to just leave room for the recipient and let the
Mhm.
person receiving the feedback decide what to do with it and potentially how to improve. Now, there may be exceptions, right? Sometimes when I've worked with, more junior employees or folks fresh out of college or something, they may not, they may not even know what they could do differently because they haven't experienced this world or this realm yet. So maybe it does serve me to give them a couple of ideas up front, um, but just leaving room for them to take the feedback and do whatever they want to with it, and also leave room for them to come back to you if they want to, if they do want to understand the feedback better, or they have questions about how their behavior could change in the future. um, so that's what we're going to say for today, at least. These things could always change over time, but as far as best practices, ask for permission, describe what you observed, explain the impact, and then just leave room for them to decide what to do next. So we said in order for this to be successful, we need a culture where feedback actually works, where we can give feedback in the moment and people are expecting it. Um, and the only way to do that is to make feedback part of the culture, not just something that happens once in a while, not just at performance evaluations or only when something bad happens. So there are a few elements that you need to build a strong feedback culture and make this successful. The first thing is trust. We talk about this a lot, and I guess I would probably point people to something like the five dysfunctions of a team if they feel like they have trust issues and some activities there. But if you don't have trust with different people, if you don't trust that feedback is given in good faith, then it's not going to be taken seriously, and nothing else is really going to matter. So, Andy, have you seen differences in organizations with high trust and low trust when it comes to feedback?
Yeah, yeah. And uh, rather than ragging on the low trust environments, I think it's better to talk about like what I've seen builds high trust. And I think as leaders, we are critical in building that trusting environment, right? And if we want folks to give and receive feedback, right? We're asking for vulnerability. And the only way to ask for vulnerability is to show vulnerability, right? You have to go belly up a little bit in order to show that it's okay to be vulnerable. So one of the things that, yeah, I think could be really helpful is talking about your own weaknesses, your own growth areas in front of your team and acknowledging, hey, I am working on this, right? Or acknowledging that you too have a mentor, right? Or other sorts of things. So if you want to build, if you want to build a learning organization, you have to be the person, like you have to be open about the learning that you're doing. If you want to build a feedback positive organization, you have to be open about feedback that you've received and how you're integrating that into your work. We can't just tell people what to do. They're going to observe what you do, and then they're going to mirror that going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, thinking about when I've been in high trust versus low trust organizations or situations, definitely when it's high trust, I believe that the feedback I'm receiving from those people is with the best intentions and only there to help me improve. And when I've been in low trust environments, a lot of times the feedback feels like it feels self-serving. Sometimes it feels like a personal attack, or it just feels like they
Or it's
needed something,
wildly inconsistent.
yeah, inconsistent, or just just something to bring up today to have a problem with.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so yeah, so focus on trust first before any of the other steps that we're about to talk about. If you don't have trust, don't even bother with these next steps. But then after that, to start introducing and creating a strong feedback culture, set clear expectations about feedback. And what I mean by that is make it known that feedback is normal and expected, but also set expectations about how feedback is delivered. And our next point is going to be really important about this, but we'll get to it in just a second. We talked about a feedback model that we like, and it's very similar to lots of other feedback models that you may have seen out there. If people know how the feedback works, how the feedback model works, if they know to expect it all the time, they know to expect positive and negative feedback. They know that feedback is just something that they're going to receive and that they should give to people to help them improve, and that everybody's doing it just to elevate everyone else. Then those expectations make it much easier to receive feedback. It doesn't make it scary. It doesn't make it painful. It doesn't make it hurt.
Mhm.
Anything else you can think of that can help leaders make feedback feel normal instead of something that happens out of nowhere?
Um, I think it also just comes down to consistency, right? Things we do frequently become normalized. So you can build it into part of your practices, right? Feedback as part of your one-on-ones, or asking for feedback, right? And that I think is a real key part, right? People will get on board with things that they do frequently, right? And if it's an infrequent thing, it's going to be really, really challenging. But if you have frequently high expectations, people will typically meet those high expectations.
Absolutely. I kind of previewed this next point, but uh, make feedback positive and frequent, and not just negative and frequent. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
evidence that says for every one negative interaction, you need to have, sometimes it says three just to break even, or sometimes it's five, sometimes it's more than that to have it become a positive interaction. And I think one of the big problems with feedback is that most of the time people are worried about how to give feedback. And the reason is because they're only thinking about it in terms of like negative feedback or constructive feedback. And if we normalize the idea of giving feedback for things that you like, for things that are positive, because we said feedback is future focused. So if you see behavior that you like and you want to keep seeing that behavior in the future, then you should give feedback that you like what they did and that you want to keep seeing more of it. And if I say, hey, I'm going to start giving feedback, and we're not a feedback culture yet, and nobody's ever had
Mhm.
feedback, and I say I'm going to start giving you feedback, but for the next month or 6 weeks or whatever, I'm only going to give positive feedback. So you don't have anything to be afraid of when I ask if I can give you some feedback. And only after we get to a certain point will I start bringing in some more of this constructive feedback, or things that I'd like to see you improve. And if you keep up a ratio of, say 5 positive feedbacks for every one that you feel is constructive, then it won't be scary at all to receive feedback because most of the time you're going to be hearing what a good job you're doing and how you should keep doing what you're doing. And sometimes you'll get feedback that says, hey, you're doing great in all these other areas, and this one area could be a little bit better. And that feels a lot better than the drive by negative feedback or the, once a year you give a presentation and you get ripped apart type of feedback.
Yeah.
Um, so that's I
Well,
think
and
that it's really important there. So I mean, do you think people underestimate positive feedback?
Eh, yeah, and I think there's a couple of things you might be missing on that, Ed. One is it's huge for building trust, and not just trust of hey, I'm not just going to come down hard on you all the time. Trust, right? So not the trust in the sense of like not instilling fear. Um, but I think it also when you give positive and constructive criticism, it shows that you're actually paying attention and that you're listening, right? And then when in the models that you talked about, right, if you're giving a fair amount of positive feedback, you can also leverage that when you give constructive criticism. Hey, Ed, you're doing great at this and you're doing great at this. We've got some gaps here. But the fact that you're so successful at these other things gives me the utmost confidence that you'll be able to shore up your gaps here, right? It gives you a different leverage within that conversation too. Rather than just coming down hard on you and saying, "Hey, you're a piece of crud because of XYZ," I can say, "Hey, you're actually doing all these things that are really hard, really, really, really well, and that shows aptitude. It shows all these different values that we have. um, we need to figure out how to bring those skills and those values and those capabilities to this sector here where I think that there's some room for improvement, or to this sector here, which is the thing that's holding you back from getting promoted."
Yeah.
Right? You can also frame it not as a you need to fix this so you don't get fired. You can frame things, especially if it's true, as hey, working on this weakness that you have is going to be the key thing for your growth trajectory longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as long as that doesn't turn into a compliment sandwich, or as I always called it, a shit sandwich, where you get like a little bit of bread and then the bad part and then a little bit more bread. Um,
Yeah.
we know that doesn't work for anybody and just feels like trying to soften the blow or not an effective way to give feedback. So
Yeah, yeah. I would not advise the shit sandwich, because people either only pay attention to the shit or they only pay attention to the bread, and it like the method. It's one of those softening the blows methodologies that, in my opinion, is wildly ineffective. You should be clear and direct and objective. Almost like a dispassionate third party observer.
yeah. So we said the key elements so far were trust comes first, that you need to set clear expectations. Feedback should be frequent and not just negative, should have positive in there as well. And then the last element of a strong feedback culture is, and we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but we respect readiness, but don't avoid tough conversations. So if I ask you if I can give you some feedback and you're not ready for the feedback right now, um, I can acknowledge that and I can maybe step away from needing to give you the feedback right away. Maybe for me personally, I might need to go write it down or something. If I felt like if I feel like I can't let it go, that might be a way for me to drop it. Um, but if somebody's not ready, just acknowledge it and give them some space and some time. But as we said earlier, don't let it slide forever. Hopefully, it doesn't turn into it needing to be a performance conversation down the road, and we can keep them as feedback conversations. But sometimes that happens, and I've been there too, where I'm just, maybe I'm just not in the headspace right now to receive feedback, and it'd be better to come back around to it another time. Anything else you'd want to add about the best way to handle when someone's not ready to hear feedback?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah, I think the key takeaway is that being able to engage in hard conversations is a cornerstone of leadership overall. If you're not willing or able to have those hard conversations, you're doing the team that you work with a major disservice, right? Because if you can't provide constructive criticism in a timely manner, with enough time to fix those issues before it becomes a performance issue, you basically have a premeditated performance issue, right? And that's not fair to you. It's not fair to your team. And it's incumbent upon you to stay on top of those things and to provide people with the appropriate, feedback and avenues to improve before it turns into something critical.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's a great place to close it out today. Today, we talked about what makes feedback effective, how to structure it, and why it needs to be part of a workplace culture, not just a one time event, and some of the steps you can do to make your culture more of a feedback culture. As you think about this, ask yourself, how do you give feedback? Is it clear, constructive, and focused on the future? Or does it sometimes feel like you're just pointing out problems? Thanks for exploring leadership with us today on Leadership Explored. If you found value in this discussion, please subscribe and share it with your network. And don't forget, this was just part one of our conversation on feedback. Next time, we're talking about receiving feedback, how to process it, use it, and maybe we'll even talk about how you could push back if it's necessary. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesday, so be sure to tune in for the next one. Until then, keep leading with purpose.